Welcome to the Authority of Love. I'm Greg Williams, and I thank you again for joining us. I've shared where you can get this at WJMM.com or 99.1 FM in Central Kentucky on WJMM there, or on the Podbean page, loveandlordship.podbean.com, all the podcasts, or on our Vimeo page, Love and Lordship Vimeo page, which is vimeo.com/Love and Lordship. So avail yourself of those if you will and share them to help others with the message, whether it's an individual, a couple, a marriage, family, maybe even a church leader. You can also reach me at loveandlordship@gmail.com. That's love and lordship all spelled out at gmail.com. And we'd love to hear from you and maybe even invite you to be a guest at some point. So today we're going to move from the cultural paradigm that I talked about yesterday of they're sowing deception and lies, claiming it's scientific and convincing people through that, but they're using tainted and tailored research to support their failed and destructive ideology and agenda, has, as we discussed yesterday, program, has given us, all of this has given us terrible outcomes. So where in the world is the church and our churches when it comes to refuting all of these lies and the reaping of horrific fruit that demeans and destroys? Because it's there. I've said it each day nearly, the proof's in the pudding. We're the only ones that can come against this. God's truth through his people is the only way this can turn around. For a long time, and for the most part, churches were silent and absent in this battle. Not everyone, but most of them. Again, allowing the culture to claim these issues as political or legislative or educational. We're taking care of that in government and education and media. Well, we see where that's led and what that looks like, right? Knowing that most churches and leaders would, in fear, hide behind the faulty and wrong idea of separation of church and state, instead of standing on God's truth and coming against those lies. In the last couple of decades, there has been some efforts and movements, thank the Lord, which have given us some hope and some good fruit in our culture. But because it largely follows the same patterns and systems, we have still been overwhelmed and are losing ground. I want to repeat a quote from yesterday's message. Our far too common silence or even agreement have made us complicit in reaping what has been sown and is being sown. The seeds and roots of our culture have given us bad fruit that is destroying present and future generations. We must stand firm on God's truth as church leaders, members, and servants. All of us as his disciples, disciples of Christ, to show forth his light to a dark and dying world. Not just asking them to come to church and have the pastor preach on it every once in a while. We all need to stand. We need to come together in strength and unity, in grace and mercy and love, and know that he will use us. Why is this? Because for the most part, we have continued to put forth programmatic responses that may help with a little bit of education and knowledge, but have done very little to truly build loving relationships, make disciples, and therefore lead to loving obedience and accountability needed to overcome the lies and deception, to sow seeds of truth and righteousness in relationships and lead in Christ's loving authority. Let me explain further as I share with regard to the majority of the current church paradigm. Conform to the world, reaping what we've sown. Romans 12:2 states that we are not to conform to the world, and Galatians 6, 7, and 8 reminds us that the outcome of doing so is that we will reap what we sow, which is if we sow like the world does, we will get pretty much the same thing. You see, in the tree that I described yesterday as black in its roots from Planned Parenthood, SECUS, and Advocates for Youth, you can go back and listen to that if you want to. Email me or touch base with me and I'll answer any questions you have. We found that the trunk, the branches, the leaves, and the fruit were all blackened. Death and destruction. Now, as the modern church has implemented its strategies and programs, I get this and this concept that came to me and I've shared with many about the tree and the fruit from Matthew 12:33. Make a tree good and its fruit will be good, or make a tree bad and its fruit will be bad. For a tree is recognized by its fruit. Matthew 12:33. The fruit of the current paradigm is that while we have some programs, we've essentially allowed the continuance of seeds being sown to the predominant culture with horrific roots of death, a trunk of death, and fruit and leaves of death and destruction, with occasional fruit that begins to pop up that's good. But because there's still the foundations are still sowing seeds of death and destruction, that's what we're predominantly going to get. You see, the same groups and their deceptive, destructive teachings are still predominating the culture, education, media, social media, government. And they wield control, and we do very little to stand against it. But we have our programs and our systems in our churches, and we give a little bit of that, so we begin to see some changes. Let me tell you what this looks like. You see, the church enters while the seeds and the roots are still predominantly Planned Parenthood, SIECUS, Advocates for Youth with their condom promotion, their free sex education, which a large majority of our youth and the last 2 or 3 generations have received. But then the church in the past 20 or so years has entered the equation with a symptomatic response. Let's look at the symptoms: divorce, the fruit, the leaves of the corrupt and dying tree. Divorce, teen unwed pregnancy, suicidal tendencies, addiction, promiscuity, STDs, fatherless homes, depression, anxiety, abortion, cohabitation, pornography, and pornea. They're still running amok and growing. But every once in a while, because we do a symptomatic response and spend a few hours a year compared to several hours a day on the other side, we see, and these are good things, but we got to go deeper. We'll talk about that more tomorrow. We have some premarital counseling and education now. We have some divorce recovery, trying to help people in their relationships in both of those areas. We have some marriage enrichment. Those things help, but again, we spend a few hours a year, and they're still bombarded with a few hours a day and a week in the weeks by the other side and their destructive seeds. We have some reconciled and saved marriages, because a few people get it and have a desire to, with that limited amount of sowing. And then we have, in the same vein, some restored homes and families. Now, those are good. And what I do on the tree in the current paradigm is the roots and the seeds and the trunk and the branches and most of the leaves and the fruit are still black, because that's predominantly what we're allowing to happen. But because we have a symptomatic response, we have some minimal life-giving outcomes that are changing a little bit of this that I just read off to you: premarital counseling, divorce recovery, marriage enrichment, reconciled saved marriages, restored homes, families, some fathers return to their homes, or mothers, as the case may be. And those are good things. But because we're still conformed to the world and doing it symptomatically or programmatically rather than making it the seeds and the roots and coming together to make it God's truth stronger than the junk and the destructive seeds of the world, it's very little. Churches enter with their symptomatic response of some great programs. Again, marriage prep, enrichment, mentoring, reconciliation, divorce recovery, possibly sexual risk avoidance. They teach and encourage abstinence or purity and building healthy relationships and healthy people. And this results again in some saved marriages and restored family, but far too many are still exposed to the filth, the destructive, the bad seed, and immorality, sexual immorality, lack of relational integrity of the free sex programs, the overwhelming sowing of the bad seeds. And we continue to reap the consequences: destroyed lives and relationships into future generations. How often have our classes and programs and ministries in the symptomatic response, even with the greatest of intentions, fallen flat because we have either ignored His priorities and order, or we have been blinded to them and based our success on numbers? Well, we had a bunch come to our conference or our classes. When they fail, We have to come up with a new class, a ministry, or program that looks good because it addresses the symptom. It keeps the excitement, the emotional excitement, rather than encourage, test, and hold accountable the relationships being built on His truth. That's discipleship in His Word. That's the kingdom. The fruit in this current paradigm remains overwhelmingly bad because the seeds sown are bad. Therefore, scripturally, we must reap the destruction as we pluck a few out of it. The bad seeds are sown several hours weekly, as I've said, or even daily in schools and exponentially multiplied as they direct youth and children to their internet presence. And then it gets exponential, as I said. Contrast that with compounding the message with a church system or program that may add up to a few hours annually in a youth group or a sermon and maybe a week at camp. I believe that these are done with great hearts and great intent, but the real question is, are they working? We may rescue a few from the dangers and consequences of immoral relationships and sexuality, but the enemy's bombarding message continues to reach thousands more through the schools, internet, and media. And unless we change the paradigm to obedience-based discipleship in loving relationships within our churches, we will continue to win a few hearts and lose many, many more. Yes, it requires diligence. And yes, some won't like it and will walk away. They did the same to Jesus. But it will be worth it as we see marriages, homes, and families that are the building blocks of His bride and family, the church. Then, because of the life-infusing examples of marriage and loving, godly relationships in our homes and then in the church, the world will clamor. Not all of it, but more will clamor for this kind of love. There are good examples and some wonderful relationships out there, but the reality is that in our churches and certainly in our larger culture, there is a glaring absence. I don't think it's because we don't care. I think it's because in our desire to see people saved, we've redesigned His order to draw people in to hear a gospel message. However, the enemy has taken full advantage of our heartfelt but misplaced priorities when it comes to expecting obedience, building loving relationships, and making disciples. Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, He has rejected you as king. That was His warning to Saul in 1 Samuel 15, 22 and 23 today, and to us as man-fearing rather than God-fearing churches and so-called disciples. There is a better way, and it's found in God's Word, the very essence of our book and others. Obedience-based discipleship under Christ's teaching in our families and loving relationships within our churches, and the church is stepping up to reinforce these messages and relationships to encourage obedience and accountability with grace and truth. Strengthen the marriage and family, and we all win. Let me close with this food for thought. The church's response is predominantly symptomatic. God's order is to move from the individual to relationships to community and then to corporate or systemic. If we do not heed His word with individuals and in relationships, we will not be able to spread it in our communities or systems. Surely we've seen the evidence in the fruit for what has been sown and how starting and trying to address and overcome it with symptomatic and programmatic responses have left us with some snatched from the fire, while the numbers still strongly show that we are losing this battle. There has to be a better way, and God has shown us if we will follow His covenant order. Thank you for joining us. You're listening to Greg Williams with the Authority of